Beginning in 1935, because of all the pressure he was experiencing from the political left, FDR will launch what's called the Second New Deal. The first New Deal, a lot of it had been very experimental and just trying stuff. Second New Deal will be a lot more planned out, especially when it came to work relief. One of the first programs and one of the most famous programs of the New Deal, especially when it came to relief for the unemployed or welfare, is the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. The WPA was like the CWA, so it is work relief, or creating jobs so you can pay people. But the difference is the CWA had been very quickly thrown together in an emergency measure. It was not very thought out and didn't last very long. The WPA, it's also work relief, but it was much more thought out. And so the jobs were more thought out, and over the course of its existence, from 1935 to 1941, it will spend about $1.5 billion a year and employ about 2 million people every month. So it is a massive work program, and it is the work program that will stay until it is no longer needed. The idea is private companies were not hiring because unemployment was still too high. The economy has still not recovered. So the government was going to hire people and put them to work. Now, under the WPA, one important feature was workers were always paid less than the prevailing wages, or what they would make in the private sector when the economy was doing well. So WPA, they did things like the CWA that were short-term and not entirely necessary. So a big one was sidewalks. If you live in Denton, Texas, and you walk around the square, and you walk around the campuses, and you pay attention and look down, you will see stamps of WPA. WPA built a lot of the sidewalks in Denton. They built a lot of the water systems, the drain systems, and sanitary systems in the areas. A lot of places in the U.S. Are sidewalks absolutely essential? Of course not. Kind of nice though. But the WPA will also build some much bigger long-term projects that have lasting value, like the San Antonio River Walk. That was a WPA project, and it's estimated it brings in about $2 billion in tourist revenue a year for San Antonio. So that is one of the very successful programs of the WPA. They also built Houston City Hall, the Corps of Cadet dormitories at A&M, and WPA, like the PWA, or Public Works, just will build some very large and permanent structures. Chilton Hall, Sycamore Hall at UNT. So they will build a lot of structures that have permanent value, like the PWA. So it is work relief, but it is much more planned out than before. WPA also got very original in that it hired people to do jobs that were based on their skill set. So they hired unemployed historians to go out and interview former slaves. By the 1930s, there were still people alive that had been slaves. Obviously, they were much older by this point, and they were passing away very fast, but there were still enough that every single southern state has slave narratives, and it's historians going out and interviewing them to find out what it was like. The only reason we know what slavery was like from a slave's perspective was because of the New Deal. I think in Texas, slave narratives, I think it's something like 15 or 16 volumes of just people's stories of what it was like to be slaves. But the WPA even hired artists to practice their craft. There was a whole art program and an education program. They hired teachers to provide free classes so people could get high school diplomas. They hired artists to paint murals all over the country. There are still murals that you can find, especially at post offices, that are from the WPA. But I guarantee you every state has WPA murals somewhere. They also hired unemployed actors and actresses to put on shows. They hired unemployed musicians to put on musical performances. Are any of these things necessary? Of course not. But not only did it give the workers the ability to practice their trade and be paid for it, but these things generally did bring up the mood of the country. You know, these things were our program are notorious for making people just feel better about life because everything didn't feel quite so bleak. WPA also had an entire section helping high school and college students. It's called the National Youth Administration, or the NYA. It is a part of the WPA. NYA paid high school and college students to do work around or in their whatever school they were attending so they could earn some money to stay in school. And it was incredibly effective. It helped more than 9 million students. Many of them would have had to drop out of school. So NYA was really effective. In Texas, it was headed by a guy named Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was absolutely adamant that money should go to those in the most need. So the NYA, it actually was one of the programs of the entire New Deal that was the most integrated, in that it helped African Americans and Mexican Americans not to the same degree as whites, but it provided them a lot of assistance. And they even had a director of Negro Affairs. So NYA was probably the most integrated part of the entire New Deal. And over the entire New Deal, if you go program by program, most of them were still discriminated against African Americans, but they, even though they discriminated, they still provided help to African Americans. At the same time, the WPA was passed. The Social Security Act was passed. And this is what FDR will call the cornerstone, or the supreme achievement of the New Deal. And if you remember from the Progressive Era lecture, Teddy Roosevelt had called for this when he ran for the Progressive Party. Social Security Act, most people just think of the senior section of it, but it actually has 3 parts, and these are very important to know. To this day, it has 3 parts. First, unemployment. So when someone is let go from a job and they file for unemployment, that comes from a pool of money. Federal government and state governments pool their money into this unemployment insurance, and that is what pay people. And unemployment insurance is to get people through rough patches. So they can get this after they lose a job or before they get another job. So unemployment insurance, it got a lot of people through the COVID pandemic. Second part is the federal government was going to provide work relief for able bodies or people that are capable of working. State governments would then take care of people that were called unemployable, or people that were not capable of working, like dependent children, blind, disabled. And so to this day, if you have disabilities that make it so you cannot work, you sign up for Social Security. And the last part is the part that everyone knows about: compulsory old age insurance through a transfer payment system. And the word insurance is important there. The way Social Security works, working age people are taxed. If you get a pay stub, you will see tax taken out of it, payroll tax. You're paying a tax into a pool, and that pool is then being transferred to seniors. So it is taxing young people to pay for seniors' Social Security. The reason it's compulsory, everyone has to pay into this system. And the reason it is a transfer payment system, because at the time this is brand new in the world. There are other countries in the world had Social Security, but the way it worked everywhere else in the world was, the government taxes everyone, and then from the government's general coffers, it pays seniors. The United States at the time was the only one to create a transfer payment system where money is going from young people to old people, and that was very intentional. It was actually bad economics because you're taking money out of circulation, which that is part of the reason, one of the causes of the Great Depression. But economically, it was bad, and FDR knew that, and FDR was told by a lot of people this bad economics, and he made it very clear, you may be right about the economics, but politically, if Social Security is going to exist, it needs to be a transfer payment system. That way, no politician in the future can get rid of it. That's why everyone expects to have Social Security, because they have been paying into it their entire life. So when they get to be a certain age, they are expecting it because they have been taxed for it. So it was a very, very conservative pension system compared to every other pension system in the world. Now, what's really important to know about this is FDR made it very clear this is going to provide a minimum standard of living. It is not meant to be retirement. And he was very adamant about that. When the first Social Security payments went out in 1937, they averaged about $22, which today would be $474. That is what Social Security was supposed to be. It was supposed to be $474, or enough to survive and prevent starvation. It was not meant to be a retirement plan. So it was meant to be in that range of $400 or $500 a month. Today, it is average Social Security payments are somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,900. In 2019, it was $1,400, and in 2024, it's $1,900. So in the last 5 years, it has increased about $100 a year. And the idea is, as inflation happens, there's supposed to be adjustment of costs of living happening. Just throw this out there, why that makes sense for seniors, but a minimum wage doesn't make sense for young working people is beyond me, but I'll admit I'm probably just not smart enough to understand that. Social Security was not meant to be a retirement plan, and I'm not attacking Social Security and saying we should get rid of it, because we should not, or anything like that. The reason this is so important to know is because there are a lot of things you can criticize about Social Security, but it has changed from what it was meant to be. And that was not the fault of FDR and the New Deal. It was when it started, what it was, compared to what it is now, is vastly, vastly different. Other thing that you really need to know is this is the single most important welfare measure ever passed in U.S. history. And people get very upset when you call it a welfare measure. It's not welfare. Yes, it is. It is welfare by every definition of what welfare is. It is welfare. It is the federal government providing a program that is looking out for the welfare of its population. So no matter what anyone says, it is welfare. And it's just people have such a bad view of the word welfare, but this is the epitome of a welfare measure, and it is the longest lasting welfare measure and the most significant welfare program ever passed in U.S. history. So Social Security and the WPA, they were passed together, and they're meant to be complementary to each other. This is to take care of the welfare of the majority of Americans so they can survive. Another program passed during the Second New Deal, which is wildly important. It's a wildly successful measure that most people have forgotten about, the Rural Electrification Administration, REA. Most rural areas in the United States did not have electricity because private electric companies, it was not economically worthwhile for them to put power lines out into rural areas. So what the REA did is, it's kind of like the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It is a government agency that provides low interest, long-term loans to cooperatives. So a bunch of people in a rural area get together, form a cooperative, and they apply for a loan. They get a low interest, long-term loan, and then with that loan, they are able to put up a distribution center, distribution lines to their area. So we were talking about really low interest and really long term. So, in an entire city, they might have a 1-2% interest rate over a 30-40 year period. So basically over that entire period, everyone that lives in that area is going to pay a little bit in taxes for electricity. And it is an unmitigated success story of the New Deal. In 1935, when this was created, about 9 in 10 people in rural areas, in Texas definitely, but also nationally, 9 in 10 people in rural areas did not have electricity. So only 10% of people in rural areas did. By 1950, 15 years later, only 1 in 10 did not have electricity. So it was fantastically successful. And it was one of the New Deal programs, because again, it's not giving anyone anything. They have to pay for it. It's just giving them the opportunity to get it at low interest, long term, so they can afford it. In terms of workers, by 1935, 1936, and especially 1937, there started to be a lot more strikes and labor violence. Workers started protesting more and more. And so the New Deal, under the New Deal, the single most important legislation ever passed for workers was created, the National Labor Relations Act, which created the National Labor Relations Board. National Labor Relations Board, again, it's the single most important measure ever passed in U.S. history to help workers, and the point of it is to help them organize. The National Labor Relations Board, which is still around today, it oversees the creation of unions and elections. So if there's a company, or if there's some workers that want to organize, then the NLRB is responsible for making sure that they are able to have fair elections and create unions if they want to. Before this, like in the 1920s with yellow dog contracts and the American Plan, stuff like that, what we call open shop now, companies would do things to force workers to not create unions. This gives workers the opportunity to create unions. And it's really important to remember, just because a union is created does not mean it will be successful. All it means is workers have the ability to bargain, because individually they don't have any power whatsoever. This just gives them the opportunity to organize so they can bargain. Doesn't guarantee anything. NLRB, if you paid attention at all to the last couple of years, especially Starbucks and Amazon, especially Amazon, there have been attempts to organize, and Amazon did things that were blatantly illegal to stop workers from organizing. The NLRB came and put a stop to it. So it is giving workers the opportunity to organize, and it is still around to this day. Now, how is all this paid for? There will be one major act passed to ostensibly pay for the New Deal. The Revenue Act of 1935. At the time it was passed, it was called the Soak the Rich tax, because the level of it was so much that it made people a lot of people freaked out. To this day, it is very misunderstood because it seems like it is just debilitating. The highest tax rate under this was 78%. Now, that is insane. However, when it was passed, it only applied to one family, and that was the Rockefeller family at the time. The Revenue Act, the levels were so high that it only affected 4% of the U.S. population. The rates were so incredibly low, too, that it never generated very much revenue. So we're not talking about a huge amount of money. It didn't bring in a lot of money, and also the highest rate was insanely high, but it really was more symbolic, and it was more FDR and his administration trying to pretend that they were actually paying for this, because they weren't. All of this, everything of the New Deal, was debt spending. It all basically went on the U.S. credit card. So throughout the New Deal, they will never once have a balanced budget, ever. And there's never enough revenue brought in from taxes to pay for any of it. So there were symbolic and political measures passed, but none of them ever actually amounted to anything. And the New Deal will be all debt spending.